My practice it's very process based and it's very experimental. So I usually don't know exactly what it is that I'm going to be making at the beginning of a project, although I do have like different research questions, etc., that I'm looking at, and I might mix a couple of things together that might not necessarily make any sense. Most of my work doesn't necessarily make sense as such. It usually kind of deliberately doesn't make sense, and that's sort of an approach that I've used as much as possible in my practice, because I like the audience or the viewer to look at the work and have completely their own take on it, and for whatever their take is to be, the right take in a sense. So there's nothing specific that I'm trying to, I'm not trying to say this is the way, I'm trying to say here are ways of putting things together. So it's about the way the viewer puts things together when they approach the work. I guess when I'm starting to work on a project, I often bring lots of things in together into the studio and start sort of playing around with them. All of my work is pretty much installation based. So when I have an exhibition, I usually I look at the space as an entire environment. So I look at the lighting, I look at the walls, I look at the floor, I think about sound, I think about who's coming into the space, and I usually end up painting the walls. It becomes like a walk-in installation, a walk-in environment, and it becomes a site for things. So the paintings that I have in there, they kind of feature within the environment, but I don't have this sort of broken up situation where you would look at one work and then another and there would be nothing in between. So my work is very, very process based in that sense, so that even when people are coming in, that's part of the process, people coming into the space, interacting with the space, to the point that I also invite other artists to come into the space and do performances that respond to what's there. So recently in Melbourne, I had an exhibition at Gertrude Contemporary, and I was invited to create an installation in the front space, which is a massive glass box that looks out onto the street. So when I first came in, I didn't actually come in because I was in Sydney. So I looked at images, as many images as I could find of the space, and then using Photoshop, I started to play around with some of the objects that I already had, and even like just really rough ideas of what things might go where. Looking at it, I decided that the floor was really just going to destroy my work. So I paid a carpenter to lay the floor down, and that floor became part of the work as well. So I painted the floor, I painted the walls, I introduced sculptures. Some of them lay on the floor, some of them were upright, as if they were in a state of process. So while I'm putting things together, I often don't finish them. So a lot of the paintings were hung on the walls in these fabric kind of bags and things, and some of them were still leaning on the wall or still half in their packaging. So I like to show this this transformation process that happens as part of the work. So it's important to me that the viewer can see that there has been activity in there, and it gives it a sort of sense of a performance and also sort of action by leaving things kind of unfinished or in a state of flux. So those are all kind of around in the space, the objects and the paintings, as well as the painted walls and the floor. And I then invited 2 sound artists to come in and create a performance that responded to the site. And there were no kind of limitations on that. It was like, you guys are artists. It was Tarquin Marnek and Joel Stern. Tarquin Marnek's an amazing sound artist who is in a group called Bum Creek that you might be aware of. It's like an art band. And Joel Stern is an art director, an artist, a sound artist. He has many roles. So these guys came in and really responded to the installation. So Tarquin asked me to read out the names of these extinct species that I'd written on one of the glass paintings. And after that, after he'd recorded my voice, he kind of like then put it through various different applications so that it was not recognisable, thankfully. And then used that in the sound thing. He also used one of my costumes. It's made of flattened beer caps as a percussive instrument. So yeah, the way that they responded to the site was really materially and as well as conceptually, and I found that to be really interesting. So I see my exhibitions as sites or stages for things that happen. So the paintings, the sculptures, etc., they're all part of the environment where that happens. So for a time, those objects are gathered there, and there's this activity that happens inside them, and then at the end of the exhibition, that sort of dissipates again. So that's also why I often bring, might use the same object in a number of different shows. My parents are environmental scientists, so environmental science is something that crops up within my work. I don't like to say my work has like a specific theme, or my work is about something, because it's about many things, and many things come into it. But I started off a project last year, and I combined two quite weird things. One of them was a site visit to a place that my parents were doing biodiversity surveys. I took part in the surveys, and basically they were assessing the biodiversity of a certain area, looking at species of plants and animals, etc. So I came with them and documented what they were doing in various ways, and I also collected their research notes, etc. So I took part in that, and that became like a little kicking off point. I knew that that's what I was going to begin with. I had no idea what was going to happen after that, but I knew where I was exhibiting, which was at 55 Sydenham Road. So I started off with this basic starting point, and then the other starting point that I began with was there's a book written by Alejandro Jodorowsky called Psychomagic. Jodorowsky is a really famous sort of cult 70s filmmaker, and he made films like El Topo and The Holy Mountain. And in this book he talks about how everybody has this thing inside them that's sort of trying to come out, and that if you put people in the right conditions, that they will actually perform in a certain way. So and it's up to him when he's making particular kind of scenarios to actually create that environment. Okay, so that's what I was sort of thinking about, and when I ended up inviting a lot of people to be involved in this project, and because I had an artist from Norway, I had some sound artists from Melbourne, I had people from the Blue Mountains, I had students from UNSW and also from Sydney College of the Arts. So there were lots of different people involved, and it was really hard for me to get them all together. So I created a file on Google Drive, and I dumped all the research in there. And I said, look, you take what you want and my documentation and whatever, and do whatever you like with it. So everyone did different things, and you also, artists were allowed to put things back in after they'd worked on them. So there was a kind of combination of different things, processes going on there. But as you can see, it's already very process-based. There's no, this is what it's going to be like. It's like, okay, well, what do you want to do? How would you respond within this scenario? As the project evolved, we collected everything that everybody had made, and I spent 2 weeks installing the show. And during that time, the audience or viewers could come in at any time and see what was going on. So the idea is that the process begins at the beginning and is sort of visible all the way through for people to kind of have a look at. So it's also about just responding to what's happening. At one point, the exhibition looked, it started to develop this sort of metallic theme. I don't know why, just, and suddenly I found this massive silver roll that Yakov, the director at the time of 55 Sydenham Road, had, and he gave me this roll of silver foil, and I just covered the whole walls in it. And then we had some metalworking machines that we just happened to get. And then we had the sound artists from Melbourne created this work that was really metallic-y, and it was quite unusual for them. And so this thing started to develop. And I think what happened was we just decided to kind of go with it. So it's that idea of being open to what might happen while you're in the space and not trying to control things and letting things develop. So I think that's a really important part of my process, and that's sort of what I always hold on to, is this idea of being open and play. The whole time I was going through art school, I think I really didn't understand how it was going to work in the sort of like outside world. And my biggest kind of piece of advice to students would be not to ever think when you're at art school that this is something that happens and then you go into the outside world. My advice would be the connections that you make here, like especially with your teachers, as well as your peers and everybody around you, are the connections that you will take with you out into the kind of the larger sort of art community. And the art community, even just in Sydney, is so interconnected. So never feel that you're going to do all this stuff now and then you're going to take it outside and then people are going to look at it. So people are already looking at it. People are already having conversations, etc. So really engage with what it is that you're doing when you're within the school. So at the moment, I've been working for the first time in kind of like the artist's ideal studio. Okay, so it's water views, it's down above art space. I've got the Finger Wharf out in front of me. I've got artists all around me, and downstairs this incredible resource, which is art space. So I've got curators coming up weekly, visiting from New York or Finland or wherever, coming up and seeing my work, and it's an amazing space to be in. But I know it's only for 1 year, and it's a very unusual space because I'm not paying for it. It's huge. I have so many facilities at my disposal, but that's not really, you can still make work without those things, and it's really important to be able to think about making work in a way that doesn't involve having to have those resources there. So when I think back over the time that I haven't had those things made available to me, I think when I was in Berlin, I had no studio to speak of, and I just used my bedroom floor. I had no money, so I just invested what little money that I had at the beginning of my 6 months exchange there, which was from SEA actually, in ink and paper, and just spent the whole time drawing. And at another point during that residency, I went to Latvia and took part in this sort of residency that was kind of not really a residency. No one was actually there when we got there, but it was an abandoned place. I had no art materials. All I had was a small sewing kit and a camera. So my response to that was okay, look, let's gather materials from the site, collect them, make costumes out of them, whatever, photograph it all, and then kind of just deal with what you have around you. So the materials were things like weeds, discarded bottle caps, foil off the top of the beer bottle, it's really not about the materials, it's actually about the forming process. That's what's actually important about making work, to me at least. So I think it's really important to be able to have that ability to work in both of those kinds of spaces.